Okay, I might get things underway. There are still some people coming in, but we like to start our welcomes on time. First of all, welcome. My name is Olivier Crisho, and this is the 2023 Sydney Asian Art Series. If there are any sort of technical difficulties, please do let us know in the chat, but hopefully you can all hear me. It's my pleasure to welcome you as the convener of the series, and I'll introduce you in just a moment to my co-convener, who'll say a few words about the theme. I'd like to begin, as is customary, by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation, on whose unceded lands I live and work, and from which I'm speaking today, particularly Wongal land on the south side of the Parramatta River. Since 2017, this series has been presented by the Power Institute at the University of Sydney in partnership with the Art Gallery of New South Wales and with the generous support of Vis Asia at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I'd like to, first of all, also thank our partners, especially Vis Asia. They've made it possible to welcome 4 speakers a year from around the world who have spoken on timely themes and really leading research around a timely theme each year. But in particular, they've also made it possible, their ongoing support has made it possible to develop the series even further. And so for the next 3 years, we'll actually be connecting the annual themes of the series under an overarching agenda titled Cura. And you can see the word just above me here, Cura, collection, community, and care. The Latin term cura is the root, of course, of English words such as curator and care. However, cura was also the name of a goddess who is said to have fashioned the first human from clay. So these multiple meanings, including care, creation, and devotion, underpin not just the practice of curating and the idea of collection, but also its institutions. So this series asks, mindful of these kinds of historically contingent legacies, it asks how these practices of cura are shaped, how they have shaped Asian art histories, what alternative practices and institutions of collecting, community, and care might exist. And these are themes that will be explored in the events and talks that we're programming over the next 2 to 3 years. For example, in the next year, we'll be focusing on community in 2024 in a series co-convened with Yvonne Lowe, and in 2025, our series will focus on care, co-convened with Pavan Feruzze, who are both lecturers in art history at the University of Sydney. But to say more about our theme of collection this year, I'd like to invite my co-convener, Alex Borchmore, who's a lecturer here at the University of Sydney in Museum and Heritage Studies. Over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier. So as the little, this side, as the little title says, the theme this year is collection. So our focus will be on collections and collectors and collecting in Asian art history. We'll be reflecting on collection as practice, as well as collections as historical and institutional objects. So we've got experts, including Kavita tonight, speaking on Indian, South Asian, Thai, and Chinese art and material culture, exploring collecting histories and provenance issues, digital databases, complex legacies of well-known European collections and collectors. I won't say too much about what Kavita is going to be talking about because you'll hear more about that very soon. But our next speaker will be Yale Rice on the 15th of June, and she's going to be talking about digital databases, the gaps and the biases within informational hierarchies, digital representations of objects from South Asia, issues of authorship and erasure. Then on the 9th of August, we'll hear from Melody Radari, who will be in person. And I believe there'll be an online recording as well, perhaps. And she's going to be talking about Bantian ceramics. So who owns Bantian? So looking there at issues of legislation around repatriation, issues of ownership, ideas of making provenance issues a meaningful part of collection histories and display narratives, and the place of diaspora as well as source communities. We often hear a lot about source communities and issues of repatriation, and I believe Kavita will talk a bit about that tonight. But Melody will be looking at diaspora communities too. And then finally, on the 12th of October, we'll be hearing from Stacey Pearson, who's going to be focusing on the life and collections of Sir Percival David, whose name some of you might know. He was an English collector and he established a very substantial collection of Chinese ceramics. But Stacey's going to be looking more about his life and the broader context in which his collection was assembled and some of the other aspects of his life that influenced that. But yeah, tonight we'll be hearing from Kavita, talking a bit about salvation, salvage, preservation, the changing priorities and institutional agendas around colonial collecting, hidden and concealed collections and collecting histories, all things collections, basically. Thanks, Olivier. I'll hand back over to you to introduce Kavita.
Thanks, Alex. It's now my pleasure to invite our first speaker for the 2023 Sydney Asian Art Series, Professor Kavita Singh. Hello, Kavita. Professor Kavita Singh is joining us today from New Delhi. It's one of the pleasures of being able to present in this format. Of course, we would love to welcome you to Sydney in future. By way of introduction, we like to pose a couple of questions to our speakers. I'll say, first of all, as many of you will probably know, Professor Singh is formerly a professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU in India. And in 2018, she was awarded the Infosys Prize, a sort of lifetime achievement award for her, and I quote, extraordinarily illuminating study of Mughal, Rajput, and Deccan art, as well as her insightful writing on the historical function and role of museums and their significance in the increasingly fraught and conflicted social world in which visual culture exists today. I quote that from the prize because it says quite a lot, I think, about our interests in the series this year as well, and why we're delighted to be able to invite you, Kavita, to open the series. Kavita's work has been a reference for broader questions as well, although her focus, of course, is on South Asia. But questions around colonial history, repatriation, secularism and religiosity, fraught national identities, and the memorialization of what she terms difficult histories, which is a term I like very much. In addition to her many books, some of which I will ask about shortly, she's also curated exhibitions, including as a sort of guest curator at San Diego Museum of Art, as well as projects at the National Museum of India. So, as I said, by way of introduction, Kavita, hello. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and I like to ask how our guests got into the field of art history. So the focus of this series is very much about art historical practice, and the particular area of expertise that I think your earlier work is sort of looking at, and especially painting. So I'm kind of curious. I note, for example, that one of your earlier publications, the 2003 work, New Insights into Sikh Art, was at a time when you were also, I think, an editor at Marge Publications. But even much more recently, you've published Real Birds in Imagined Gardens, Mughal Painting Between Persia and Europe, looking at this issue transnationally or transculturally. So in 2016. So what, can I ask, were the questions that spurred your original interest in art history? So imagining back to your sort of post-doctoral days, what were those initial questions that you were looking for in that earlier work?
Well, in India, despite the huge amount of art and heritage monuments and so on that we have, art history is not a very big field. And so it's not even a field that you particularly know about when you're a student looking around for areas for higher study. And I stumbled on art history by accident. I just happened to read a book, which I thought was fantastic. And I said, whatever this discipline is that this book is part of, I want to be in a field like that, because it seemed to me like this endlessly elastic and exciting kind of discipline where you could take a work of art as your center of interest, but there was no limit to the methods you could use to look at it. So it just seemed like this incredibly elastic field. Before I stumbled into art history, I was thinking of doing sociology or anthropology. And so actually the very early work I did, the doctoral work, which I've published very little of, was inspired by my interest in seeing works of art functioning in their context. And so for that, I actually studied what we would perhaps call folk art traditions. These were bardic traditions in which you had oral epics being recited by bards who also carried paintings on which these epics were depicted. And so I was very interested in the way in which the bard recites, gestures towards, displays these images. And I was also very interested in the idea that, oh, there is an authentic audience somewhere, and I can see how they receive this entire performance, which includes images and texts and performance and all of that. After I finished that, I realized how incredibly precious I was being, because I realized that there is no such thing as an authentic and an inauthentic context for receiving art. They're all contexts. And I realized that our primary context is the museum. And so that got me into museum studies, where I said I'd really like to now study these institutions where we can turn the lens back on us as urban, middle-class people and see how we receive art.
So you've kind of preempted my next question, because hearing you talk about this bardic tradition brings to mind a conversation I've seen online, which I would recommend to others when you're in conversation with Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, of course, and talking a little bit about, of course, his interest in Kabir and these kinds of traditions of bardic visualization, which is fascinating. But to talk about your interest in museums, I note, for example, the wonderfully titled publications, others have said the same, in 2014, No Touching, No Spitting, No Praying, the Museum in South Asia, followed by Museums, Heritage, Culture into the Conflict Zone in 2015, and then finally, most recently, perhaps my favorite, Museum Storage and Meaning, Tales from the Crypt. All of these, of course, frame, I think, what you've just called the context of the museum in such provocative ways. And I'd like to, again, go back to this kind of moment of catalyst. Could you say a little bit more, what was the kind of catalyst, or what really prompted you to start to look at the institution? And particularly, I know that you've done quite a bit of work around the National Museum. What were the questions that sort of motivated you to look at that institution?
Well, when I got interested in museums, I was extraordinarily lucky in that I got a 1-year curatorial fellowship in the Asia Society in New York, where I actually did hands-on work on exhibitions. And what was really interesting for me was that the year I was at the Asia Society was the year, my God, I'm so old now, because it was the 50th year of the independence of India and Pakistan. And the exhibition that I got catapulted into as a curatorial assistant was actually the one that was celebrating Pakistan's history, right? So that was kind of really like a stretch for someone from India, because it's only when we leave our countries that we actually get to meet with people who are our closest neighbors geographically, but because of all kinds of political barriers, we are not able to converse quite as much. And I think perhaps that practical experience was something very interesting for me to see how self-consciously we shape narratives, how we think about audiences, and how we think about how to present objects, how to link them together, how to highlight certain aspects of their history and to suppress others, for the sake of not just what you think the audience needs to receive, but also thinking on behalf of your sponsors, thinking of, your clients, as it were, whom you're serving. So all of this gave me a lot of meat to think with. And as it happened also, I got another fellowship, which the Victoria and Albert Museum very generously runs, where they, kind of gesture of, I don't know whether you would call it a gesture of decoloniality, but quite early on had this sense of responsibility about sharing their Indian collections with Indian scholars. And they knew that there are tremendous barriers for us to access these materials. This was the internet era. And they knew that it's terribly expensive to go to London. So they started these fellowships, which allowed people to come in and study their collections, and which gave them subventions for photographs that they might want to take for publication. So when I got that fellowship to be at the V&A, I was not interested in studying, let's say, the textile collection or the painting collection. I started diving into the archive of their own history, which is fantastically preserved and in all kinds of indiscreet detail, as you will see today, right? So that gave me a very rich vein to explore. And so that was one set of things. But then back in India, of course, living in New Delhi, the biggest museum that was present in our landscape was the National Museum of India. And looking at the National Museum of India, knowing that it is formed as a nationalist gesture at the moment of independence, and knowing that everything that we did in that moment was done very much under the shadow of partition, where the need to make a claim that your country is integral and whole in the face of this wound that it has suffered really required a lot of very intentional messaging to go out, which did a lot of that curating, shaping, rearranging of things and narratives, which I had become conscious of from the first time that I had any curatorial experience. So I could read that into the way galleries were set up in the National Museum. And that got me interested in studying the history of the National Museum, but also then looking across the border at what the National Museum of Pakistan said, and how it was that two museums which substantially inherit the legacy of the same archaeological missions, and therefore have pretty much a widely overlapping corpus of objects, have to produce entirely different narratives for the sake of their national positions, for the sake of their audiences. They have to produce different narratives out of fundamentally a very, very similar set of objects. So that was something that's also been a kind of an abiding interest of mine.
Thank you so much. I already have more questions. You've pointed us in the direction of your talk, so I won't take up more of our audience's time. We will have, just as a point of housekeeping, we will have hopefully plenty of time as well for discussion after Kavita's talk tonight. There's going to be a Q&A session that my colleague Alex will be moderating. This is a webinar. Most of you are probably familiar, but that means that there should be on the bottom of your Zoom screen a little Q&A button, and there you can put your questions, and you can also follow and vote up other people's questions if you'd like that to be posed, and Alex will moderate those questions after Kavita's talk. So without further ado, I invite you, Kavita, thank you, to share your screen, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much. I want, of course, to express my gratitude to the Power Institute for including me in this very exciting series of lectures. I am honored to be part of it. And I want to thank Olivier for extending the invitation. I want to thank Alex and Nick for their collegiality. And particularly, Nick, thank you so much for everything you've done to make this go smoothly so far. And I'm really very glad to be offering this talk under this theme that you have chosen of cura, collection, community, and care. You could argue that this is an evergreen theme in museum studies. There's never a moment when these topics are not of relevance. And at the same time, you could say that today there is a new vitality, and there is even a new kind of urgency around these issues today, particularly in light of all the very quick developments that we are seeing in the area of repatriation, which has opened up any number of questions about the processes by which collections have been made, are still being made, It opens up questions about whether there is such a thing as a natural community for objects and collections of art. And it also opens up questions about what have been the forms and what have been the histories of care for these objects. And I think my talk today is going to raise questions about some of these issues by looking very specifically at the institutional lives of just 4 large-scale, indeed, I would say, architectural scaled artifacts from India that either were or are in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Some of these objects are from the 17th century, some from the 18th, some from the 19th. Some were already historic artifacts when they were collected by the museum. Some of them were very newly made. Some of them were what you would call authentic historic objects. Some of them were reproductions. But what links these 4 objects together is the fact that today you can't see them in the V&A, and you probably never will. Now, I should say at the outset that I'm focusing on the V&A because its Indian collections are truly extraordinary. They're extraordinary in their size, in their scope, in their historical significance. This is the largest collection of Indian art outside of India. And its core actually is the bulk of the collection that was built up by the East India Company. And it contains a lot of objects of very great historical significance, such as Tipu's tiger, Ranjit Singh's throne, Mughal jades and jewels, all of which were acquired during the course of the conquests that the East India Company made. And therefore, these objects, as kind of historical plunder and loot, have not just aesthetic or historical significance, but they have tremendous emotional significance for Indians today. Now, to this core of objects that was collected under such fraught historical circumstances, the museum has added many thousands of things that have reflected different aims that the museum hoped to serve at different times. So, for example, in the second half of the 19th century, it collected what we today call decorative arts. And this was done because the museum saw itself as a museum of design, which was meant to serve the trades and the industries of the time, to stimulate good design within them. And in the 20th century, the museum started thinking of itself more as an art museum, and it started pursuing the fine arts of India, both from the present and the past. But when the 4 objects that I want to study today arrived at the V&A, or at what was called the South Kensington Museum at that time, these were all considered very important acquisitions. But we'll see today that what appears as a prize in one era can become an embarrassment in another. And over time, each of these artifacts fell prey to changing priorities, and each of these objects was taken off view for a different reason and in a different way. And so while most studies of museum history focus on what is exhibited in the museum, the 4 museum objects that I'm going to be discussing today, I hope, are going to open a door to other less visible histories of the museum. So let's begin by traveling back in time to a December afternoon in 1870, as this train of 60 bullock carts struggles to carry its heavy load across the hilly and trackless terrain of central India. We're seeing porters who are straining to help the bullocks out of the mud in which the wheels are getting stuck, even as some of their cargo seems to be about to get lost to the jolting journey. Here is an Indian supervisor, a little better dressed than the coolies or the laborers, who is trying to give direction, while there's also a sahib, a white man on a horse wearing a solar topi, who is calling out instructions to him. Who are these people? What are they carrying? And where are they going? Well, the man on the horse is Lieutenant Henry Hardy Cole. He's a young sapper, a military engineer in the Indian Army. And he has recently been asked to make plaster casts of monuments in India that can then be sent back to Britain to give audiences there a sense of the scale, the monumentality, and the complexity of sculpture and architecture in India. And the first item that Henry Hardy Cole has been asked to make a cast of is a gateway for a stupa, or a funerary monument in Buddhism, the stupa at a site called Sanchi. In the books that are just beginning to be written on Indian art, this 2nd century Buddhist monument is celebrated as one of the earliest surviving stone monuments in India. And so it's to this site that Cole and his party are struggling to reach. At the point at which we see him in this painting, Cole has just spent 5 months in London, where he has been learning the techniques of plaster casting in the Victoria and Albert Museum's workshops. And now he has come by ship to Calcutta with 28 tons of material and equipment that are needed for this casting operation. And these have made their way then from Calcutta by train, then by bullock cart, and finally they have to be hand carried through the jungle to the site. The party stays on site for 6 weeks. We see a painting made of the camp that they set up. And in this painting, we see them actually carrying out the work of making the plaster cast. Now, Cole was really exultant when 6 weeks passed and his work was done. He had managed to cast the gateway in a very delicate gelatin mold process, and he cast it in 112 separate pieces, which were shipped to London. They were not going to be displayed over there, but these 112 pieces would be used as a parent cast for further copies to be made. One of these copies stayed in London, and it had its debut in Albert Hall during the International Exhibition of 1871, after which it was moved to the South Kensington Museum. 4 other copies were made that we know of, and they were sent to Edinburgh, to Dublin, to Paris, possibly to Brussels as well, and to Berlin. And each of these, when they were assembled, was a perfect facsimile of the 33-foot tall eastern gateway of the Sanchi Stupa. Now, the making of these casts of the Sanchi gateway took a huge amount of effort and skill and time and money. Cole's initial estimates for the project was for over £5,000, and that was a huge sum in the 1870s. And this money was sanctioned to make plaster casts at a time when the colonial British government of India was reluctant to spend any money at all on actual monuments in India. So what motivated them to invest so much in making plaster casts, copies of monuments? The making of these plaster casts was an extension of the enthusiasm of the time for what were called gypsothekas, or galleries of plaster casts, a vestige of which can still be seen in the Victoria and Albert Museum and in several other museums in Europe and in North America. Now, today we fetishize the original artwork, the authentic artwork. But many 19th century museums actually strove to be encyclopedias of the best of art wherever it might be. And if these museums lacked access to originals, the greatest masterpieces, then it was perfectly acceptable at the time to have three-dimensional reproduction that were as capable as photography of scale and in all 3 dimensions. And as with many technological innovations of the time, the V&A, or rather the South Kensington Museum, as it was called then, was a pioneer in championing these new technologies of reproduction. The museum saw itself as a teaching institution rather than as a temple of art. And so it had no hesitation in spending a lot of money on acquiring a large number of plaster casts, rather than focusing all of its purchasing power on a small number of original works of art. And the impetus for this collecting of casts actually came from the museum's founding director, Sir Henry Cole, who was a very influential figure in the art world of the time. He was so convinced of the usefulness of casts that at the International Exhibition of 1867 that was held in Paris, Cole got the heads of 15 European nations to sign an agreement that they would share reproductions of masterpieces of monuments in their territories, because this, he believed, would usher in an era of cooperation between these nations rather than competition between them to get hold of the single unique masterpiece. So it's in the context of these developments that the plaster casts of the Sanchi gateways were commissioned, and that an institution that was headed by Sir Henry Cole should arrange for the work in India to be done by someone called Henry Hardy Cole is not a coincidence, because the young Henry Hardy Cole was Sir Henry's own son. But Henry Hardy Cole was not a slacker. He was not someone who was just benefiting from his powerful connections. He was excellent at his work, and he pursued it with a huge amount of energy. And after Sanchi, he volunteered to make casts of a whole lot of other Indian monuments and send them to the South Kensington Museum. In fact, so numerous were the casts that Henry Hardy Cole sent to London. We see here Henry Hardy with his group of moulders working at a monument in Delhi, in fact. And he made so very many casts from sites at Fatehpur Sikri, at Agra, at Delhi, at many other places, that so many plaster casts of Indian objects reached London that the elder Cole, who was just setting up the South Kensington Museum at the time, was able to plan an entire gallery around them. And so in 1874, what were called the architecture courts opened at the South Kensington Museum, and these exhibited architecture via reproduction through the museum's collection of casts. And the architecture courts consisted of two large halls. One was for casts of Western architecture. This was dominated by Trajan's column, which you can still see in the V&A today. And the other one was a gallery for Eastern architecture, and that had the Sanchi gateway as its towering presence. Near the Sanchi gateway, they hung these three paintings that Henry Hardy Cole had commissioned, which traced the history of the making of these casts. And so this portion of the gallery didn't just celebrate Indian monuments, but it actually was itself a monument to Henry Hardy Cole's Herculean labors in the making of these casts. Now, a few years after the cast of the Sanchi Gateway and these other Indian monuments reached London, the Indian collections of this museum were suddenly hugely enlarged. How did this happen? It happened because the East India Company, which had conquered huge territories in India and had ruled them for 50 years, was wound up by order of the crown. This is a complicated history that I won't go into today. Many in the audience might already know it. Now, the museum that had been set up by the East India Company, which had a lot of that loot from many of its conquests, that museum was also dissolved. And the bulk of its collections then went to the South Kensington Museum. So now the Indian collections of this museum became so large that the museum couldn't accommodate them. And they actually rented a building across the street. So you see this red quadrangle here, which is the main building of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And there's part of an institutional complex across the road. And this red blob you see here is a set of double-storied galleries that the museum hired specially to house the vast Indian collections. Now, the East India Company collections were then united with what the South Kensington Museum already had of Indian material, and all of it was put on display in this special building for the Indian collections. And this included all the plaster casts as well, which were moved out of the architectural courts of the main building to the Indian galleries across the street, where over the space of 20 galleries, the Indian Museum mounted a display of architecture through plaster casts and through original artifacts. It mounted a display of sculptures. It had an extensive display of Indian textiles, paintings, arms and armor, and the decorative arts. The only picture I have of the Sanchi Gateway at this time is a less than happy one, because it shows a time when there was a fire in the galleries, and we can see the firemen dousing the flames against the backdrop of the Sanchi gateway. But in this house filled with exotic wonders, the Sanchi gateway became such a symbol for the strange and marvelous constructions of the East that it was invoked in exhibitions in London, even when the gateway wasn't in those exhibitions. For example, there was an impresario called Imre Kiralfi who used to mount spectacular commercial exhibitions. And when he mounted the Indian Empire exhibition in 1895, advertisements for it featured this melange of elephants rushing through the Sanchi gateway in an image that stood for metonymy, all of us exoticism, present and past. While these plaster casts were stoking the public imagination in London, the plaster casts were going to have a profound impact on the original monument back in India as well. Because the casts could travel, the originals remained on site. And this ensured that the fate of Sanchi was to be very different from other similar Buddhist sites that had been discovered and studied and celebrated in the colonial period as well. So if we look at other famous 2nd century Buddhist sites in India, particularly the stupas of Bharut and of Amravati, we can see how their surviving sculptural and architectural fragments all travel to museums, leaving nothing behind at the site itself. But because museums in the metropolis had plaster casts of the Sanchi gateway, the ruins of Sanchi could stay in place, making it possible eventually for them to be restored, right? So, I mean, it's quite a stark contrast what the presence of reproductions could do for the original. Now, in its own time, a cast such as the Sanchi gateway was a wonder in itself. And it testified not just to the qualities of a 2nd century monument in India, but it also testified to the technical prowess and the heroic labors of a group of Englishmen. Today, casts like the Viennese that remain in various collections have become old enough to be treasured as historic artifacts of Victorian times. But between the early celebration of these casts and the recent celebration of casts, there is a middle history of reception that hasn't been so positive. Because in the middle of the 20th century, there was a kind of reorientation of museum attitudes, and reproductions became something that were thought of as suitable for the museum shop, but not for the museum galleries. And along with this shift in tastes, something else happened in the middle of the 20th century that was to have a profound impact, particularly on the Indian plaster casts. Because in 1955, the lease ran out on the building that the Indian collections occupied. And the museum was given notice that that building was slated for demolition. And so the Indian collections now had to be accommodated within the Victoria and Albert Museum's own building, where they were offered a much smaller gallery. If you look at the long rectangle, the long red rectangle at center, top, that was the double-storied gallery, the footprint of the rented space. And if you look at the tiny rectangle towards the bottom of your slide, that is more or less the footprint of the gallery that the Indian collections then got within the main V&A building, right? Now, this tiny space that was now given for display of Indian objects was, of course, a huge challenge. And the new keeper of the Indian section was someone called W.G. Archer, who was an aesthete to the core. He was someone who thought that the museum's Indian collections were very mixed, and that he thought that it had a very small core of high quality Indian art, which was obscured by what he called a mountain of rubbish. And so for him, this crisis of losing those large galleries was actually an opportunity, because it was an opportunity to purge the Victoria and Albert Museum's Indian collections of all that he considered dross. And so ethnographic artifacts he gifted or he sold cheaply to other museums, but things that were copies, things that were recently made, they didn't count for anything. And for something like the cast of the Sanchi Gateway, which was enormous, which was expensive to store or to shift, and which wasn't even an original artwork to begin with, but was a reproduction, Archer had very little regard for it. And calculating that it had taken 5,000 pounds to make 5 casts, Archer reasoned that the Victoria and Albert Museum's cast cost less than 1,000 pounds, and he determined that it would cost more than the cast was worth, even to just dismantle it, pack it, transport it to a storage site. And so placing this argument in the files, Archer gave the signal. And when the Indian collections were moved out of that rented building, the plaster cast of the Sanchi Gateway was left behind. And when the building was demolished, the cast was reduced to rubble along with it. So we've seen how the making of the Sanchi cast actually allowed the Sanchi stupa itself to remain on site, allowing eventually for in situ restoration of the monument. But oddly enough, there was no compunction a few years after the Sanchi casts were made. There was no compunction in bringing over to London the next architectural object that I want to discuss. And the colonnade that I turn to now, interestingly enough, came from the most celebrated set of buildings in India, about which practically every colonial official had rhapsodized. This was the only cluster of monuments which had appealed enough even to the East India Company, which was famously tight with its purse strings, for the East India Company to actually pay for the upkeep and repairs of these buildings. And they spent more than 600,000 rupees on their repair. This cluster of privileged monuments was, of course, the Taj Mahal and other Mughal imperial monuments in and around Agra, which had been the Mughal capital. And the colonnade that we're seeing on the left-hand side came to London from the palatial apartments that had been built by Shah Jahan within the Agra fort, Shah Jahan being, of course, the famous patron of the Taj Mahal itself. So how is it that when the British authorities were willing to invest so much in the repair and upkeep of Agra's Mughal monuments, how could sections of it still be packed up and shipped overseas? You know, although the company had been generous towards the Mughal monuments of Agra, the history of these monuments was still a checkered one. And episodes of care of the monuments were interspersed with some very shocking phases of spoliation and abuse. And one instance of this actually came when Francis Rawdon Hastings, who was then the Governor General of India, visited the Agra fort in 1815. And among the buildings that he inspected was the Shahi Hammam, or the royal bath, which, as he noted, was lined and paved with marble, inlaid in the same fashion as the Taj Mahal. Now, here's a painting of the Hammam, as Hastings may have seen it, because it's painted by the artist who accompanied him on his travels. But Hastings noted that one of the domes of this bathhouse was cracked, and it was, in his words, incapable of being repaired without an expense which cannot be met, which is a triple negative, which is basically saying, you know, can't pay, won't pay, too bad. So anticipating that the dome would fall and would destroy everything beneath it, and in his own words, Hastings being anxious to rescue so delicate a work of art, he asked for the marble inside the bath to be stripped from the floor and walls, and for the baths and its fountains to be ripped out and to be sent to his home in Calcutta. On the way out of town, Hastings also saw a massive 16th century Mughal cannon lying on the banks of the Yamuna River. This cannon, called Dhundhwani, was reputedly the largest cannon that the Mughals had ever made. And Hastings considered trying to take this cannon back to Calcutta too. But unlike the imperial baths that very few people in Agra would have had access to and thus would know anything about, the cannon was in full public view. And Hastings' local advisors warned him that it might provoke a public reaction. So the gun was left alone. the marble was stripped and the hammam was despoiled. But it's not clear where the marble went, because at least some of the disassembled marble was still lying stacked in the fort when a later Governor General, Lord Bentinck, visited the Taj nearly 20 years later in 1834. And being a very fiscally prudent man, Bentinck ordered that all of this marble be auctioned to underwrite the costs of a bridge that the government had to make across the river. To this good cause of the bridge, Bentinck added more money by melting down that huge cannon that we saw a moment ago and selling its metal by weight. Now, according to Bentinck's biographer, it is this small auction of marble lumber from a ruinous bath in the Agra fort that led to the utterly wholly untrue canard that has been attached to Bentinck's name ever since. And this canard, according to his biographer, is the story that Bentinck had planned to auction off the whole of the Taj Mahal for the price of its marble. Was this rumor entirely untrue? Bentinck's auction of the Taj is mentioned by British travelers who were his contemporaries in India. And I'm afraid Bentinck's biographer would also have to contend with an interview from a resident of Mathura, a city near Agra, who says that his great-grandfather, who was the fabulously wealthy 19th century banker called Rao Bahadur Lakshmi Chand, had actually put in the winning bid for the Taj. Even though Lakshmi Chand had successfully bid for the Taj, he says he was not allowed to take possession of it because news of the sale caused too much disquiet in the Muslim community of Agra, which considered the monument its heritage. And so the authorities in London feared that there would be a riot between Hindus and Muslims, and they ordered Bentinck to cancel the auction. Now, we may never actually know what happened in Agra in those years. What was taken by Hastings to Calcutta? What was auctioned by Bentinck in Agra? But there certainly seems to have been a lot of marble going around, because 45 years later, in the 1880s, when Sir Alfred Lyell, who was the governor of the northwestern provinces of West British India, visited the Agra fort, he was able to find a large number of marble pillars inlaid with precious stones, simply lying about in the fort in Agra. And he sent 5 of these pillars with their brackets and their beams to London. And there they were shown in a huge exhibition in 1886, the Colonial and Indian exhibition. Now, in the exhibition, when these columns were exhibited, the text panel that was placed next to them offered its own ingenious explanation of how these columns became detached from the building. The pillars must have fallen when the Agra fort was attacked by an Indian ruler called Surajmal in the 18th century. And so this text panel actually shifts the responsibility for any damage or despoliation to Indian agents rather than to colonial ones. Since then, according to Lyell, the pillars had been lying buried in the fort. Lyell had recently discovered them. And so this text actually puts Lyell in the role of an explorer or an archaeologist who is a rescuer rather than a despoiler of the colony. Now, the architectural historian Ebba Koch has written a brilliant article in which she does some detective work on this colonnade. First, she finds more scattered fragments of it. Apart from the section that has reached the Victoria and Albert Museum today, there are pieces that are lying around within the Agra fort, within the museum at the Taj Mahal, and also within a museum in the nearby city of Lucknow. And then there are these columns that are built into the portico of a government guest house in Agra. Then she painstakingly reconstructs the original place within the fort where these columns had been. And in doing so, she solves the riddle of why, when we visit the exquisite Agra fort and we come to this marble terrace that faces the audience chamber, we see this startlingly ugly blank wall. This is the wall of the hammam, the royal bath, from within which Hastings had ordered the marble to be stripped, but clearly his operations had disturbed not just the interior of the building, but had also led to the dismantling of a loggia that had once stood along its exterior. And we can gain an impression of this loggia's appearance from earlier paintings of the Agra fort that were made before Bentinck or Hastings ever visited it. This may not be a perfectly accurate painting, but at least it gives us a sense of the missing pieces, where you can see how the loggia would have paralleled the audience chamber on the right-hand side. And then we can take a look at this print that was made in 1876, which shows the same terrace. And right in the foreground, we see the crumbling walls of the Shahi Hammam or the bath, alongside which, where the colonnade should have been, there stands a shack, possibly made to shelter the stacks of marble that had been taken and disassembled there. Maybe some of the marble that was stripped for Hastings in 1813 was still lying around in the fort in 1876. And perhaps the pillars that Lyell found were sheltering in this shack. So after the pillars were taken to London and they were exhibited in the exhibition in 1886, Lyell gifted them to the South Kensington Museum, and in the detail we see at bottom right, we see them installed in the extensive galleries that the Indian collections had. There, as I've mentioned before, the Indian material was spread among many galleries, and there was room to show a very large number of exhibits. So when the V&A lost that building in 1955, and when the Indian section had to be accommodated within the V&A's main building, and it was allotted the small gallery that it has now, there was no room to exhibit many of the large artifacts that the collection had earlier been able to show. We've seen how this move affected the Sanchi Gateway. Unlike the plaster cast of the Sanchi Gateway, the Agra colonnade was not destroyed at this point. W.G. Archer, the keeper, he would have valued it because it was a genuine 17th century object, but it was put into storage. In the 1980s, there was a project to revamp and reinstall the V&A's Indian collections. And the curator of the time, Deborah Swallow, was very keen that this colonnade, which was such a historically and aesthetically important thing, should be put back on show. But the exhibition designer who designed the gallery decided he didn't want to use the colonnade because it was too beautiful. And it would distract viewers. It would take their attention away from his overall design. And so as a result, when we pause at the entrance to the Mughal section in the V&A's Indian Gallery today, we pass through another Mughal colonnade that the V&A just happens to possess, but this is much more plain, while the colonnade from Agra remains in storage. Now, when the colonnade from Agra missed its opportunity for being put on show, it remained in storage, but it moved from storage to deep storage. Now, in museum speak, deep storage means that the object has gone into a place where it's safe, but from which it's not very likely to come out. Deep storage facilities are usually outside the city where space is cheap. They're often underground, where they offer safety and better temperature control, but they are much harder to retrieve. London's Science Museum uses former mine shafts as its deep storage facility. But for our colonnade, deep storage meant moving from a warehouse in London to a former military bunker in Salisbury. And so to get there, you have to take special permission. You have to travel 2 hours out of London to a secure site. And then you have to wait for the little trains that will take you deep into the bowels of the earth where objects are stored. So there, the colonnade lies, crated, stored under controlled conditions of temperature and humidity. And in this, the colonnade's fate is rather different from that of the monuments that remain in situ in Agra, that are absorbing atmospheric pollutants, that are becoming abraded and yellowed with insect droppings and acid rain. So what is one wonders? Leaving monuments to the fate of an inevitable degradation, or preserving their fragments, but in ways that makes it impossible for the objects to ever be seen or enjoyed. Let me move now to the third of my 4 artifacts, which, like the Agra colonnade, is unlikely to be seen or enjoyed by London audiences anytime soon. And this is the Gwalior Gateway, which, like the Agra colonnade, was first exhibited in London at the Colonial and Indian Exhibition of 1886. Towering above its viewers at more than 60 feet high, weighing 75 tons, this gateway attracted a lot of attention through its sheer size, though the fineness of the carving was also very remarkable. Now, the strange fortunes of this Gwalior Gateway have been described by Deborah Swallow in a brilliant essay, and in what follows, I'm only going to do not much more than paraphrase her. So, as Debbie Swallow tells us, unlike the Agra colonnade, the Gwalior Gateway was not an antique object. It was newly made, and it owes its origin to the meeting in the town of Gwalior in central India of 2 Englishmen, Caspar Purdon Clark and J.B. Keith. Caspar Purdon Clark was an architect who had a great flair for spectacle, which had drawn him into exhibition work. And he found ever more dramatic ways to set the scene to show off objects. Here, for instance, is the pavilion that he had designed to display the Prince of Wales's collection of Indian artifacts in Paris in an exhibition in 1878. And after the huge success of his Indian pavilion, Clark was appointed Special Commissioner for Indian Art for all the forthcoming exhibitions. In the early 1880s, Purdon Clark was sent to India with a sum of £5,000, and he was told to go ahead and buy objects to augment the South Kensington Museum's Indian collection. And museum records show that Clark sent back 300 packing cases that contain more than 3,400 objects, among them that grey Mughal colonnade that we were just seeing. Now, he was obviously able to pick up all kinds of things at will. But when Clark visited Gwalior, which was the site of some very splendid monuments, he met a Major J.B. Keith there, who was the curator of monuments for central India, hired by the Maharaja of Gwalior. And Swallow tells us that Keith would never have allowed Purdon Clark to seize any original architectural remains. Instead, Keith told Clark that Gwalior had very skilled stone carvers who could reproduce any historic carving. And Clark commissioned some handmade replicas of old buildings from Gwalior. In addition to what Clark commissioned for the museum, on his own initiative, Keith asked the ruler of Gwalior to support the production of a very grand gateway that would advertise the skills of Gwalior's stonemasons, who were now desperately in need of work and new markets. This gateway, when it was made, was first sent to an exhibition in Calcutta. And then the Maharaja of Gwalior wrote to London, offering the gateway as a gift to the South Kensington Museum, which the museum accepted gratefully. So in her essay, Deborah Swallow then records the consternation of the museum authorities when they received 200 boxes containing the dismantled parts of the gateway, and they realized the scale of the object that they had just been gifted. There was simply no place for the museum to display something like this. The gateway was used temporarily as the entrance to the Indian section of the 1886 exhibition, the same exhibition in which the Agra colonnade had been shown. And for Major Keith and for other sympathizers of Indian craftsmen, the hope was that showing this gateway to a London audience would bring business for the talented stone carvers of Gwalior. And so Keith was understandably very upset when, at the conclusion of the exhibition, the Gwalior gateway was dismantled and it was returned to a storage shed in South Kensington. By this time, Keith had retired to London and he was constantly lobbying the museum. He was writing letters to the authorities. He was publishing articles in the press about the Gwalior gateway and its neglect, but to no avail. Then in 1899, the South Kensington Museum announced that it would be building an extension, and Keith saw his chance. And so he redoubled his efforts to ensure that the gateway would find a place somewhere within the expanded museum. And he even started suggesting that if they continued to neglect the gateway, it'll cause a diplomatic incident with the Maharaja of Gwalior, who will be offended. Now, privately, the museum authorities referred to this gateway as that beastly thing, but eventually they were goaded to find a place for it within one of the large new halls that they had built, which was designed for Oriental art. Even this rather grand gallery was not large enough for the whole gateway, whose entire upper section had to remain in storage. So if you compare what's installed with what the entire gateway was, you can easily see how much of it couldn't be accommodated. In the end, Keats' importuning was to rebound on the gateway in an ironic way, because the Oriental and Indian collections never moved into the gallery where the gateway was installed. For some decades, the gateway presided over an assortment of Islamic artifacts. But in the 1950s, the plans for how this space would be used changed. It was now going to be used for large-scale works by Raphael. But the aesthetic of the Gwalior gateway jarred with the Raphaels. And so the decision was taken to cover the gateway up with a false front. So today, in the Raphael cartoon gallery, this protuberance in the wall is all that indicates that lying immured behind it is the main section of the Gwalior gateway. Meanwhile, the upper portions of the gateway still lie disassembled in the store. The fate of the Gwalior gateway always reminds me of the story of the unfortunate Mughal courtesan Anarkali, who was bricked up behind a wall for daring to love the crown prince of the realm. And I'm sure every Indian in the audience would have seen that story represented in the movies such as this one. Yeah, where poor Anarkali is being bricked alive behind a wall. But to think of the Gwalior gateway as a damsel in distress is sentimentalizing. And what happened to the Gwalior gateway is not simply the unique fate of one object, as we already know. There were actually many supersized architectural objects that had once been proudly displayed in the museum that later became the museum's problem. The Gwalior gateway lies immured behind a false front, but the Indian section had so many other objects. There were colonnades, there were gateways, there were whole facades of houses in wood and stone. There were 19th century copies of stonework, tile work. What was one to do with all of them? For all of these architectural objects that the Indian section had, the problem was solved in the same way as the Sanchi gateway. The files in the Victoria and Albert Museum record meeting after meeting in which these things are examined and being deemed as being either recent copies of older things or as being merely examples of decorative arts. They're declared to have no value at all. And so in conclusion, this stone front of a house from Bulandshahr is to be destroyed. The stone carvings from Gwalior to be destroyed. The copies of tile work from Multan to be destroyed. And so when the time came to vacate those old buildings, all of these things were also left behind with the Sanchi gateway. And when that building was demolished, all of these exhibits came down with it. Now, in the institutional memory of the V&A, the responsibility for this whole-scale destruction of Indian artifacts is laid at the foot of that W.G. Archer, the new keeper of the Indian section, whom we've already met. But as we look back on this mid-century moment, and as we rue the loss of those beautifully carved stone jalis and building facades, and we think of the works of carvers in different parts of the country, the masons, the laborers who accompanied Henry Hardy Cole on his expedition to Sanchi, we think of all of their work and skill being laid to waste. Let us not lay the blame for all of this loss at one individual's door. the decision to dispose of this material was taken by committee, which included the highest authorities of the museum at the time, including the museum's director, Lee Ashton, and including John Pope Hennessy, famous scholar of Renaissance sculpture, who was later to become the director of the V&A, and then even later the director of the British Museum. So let me end this story with a final tale of travel of an object, which is both a coming and a going, a journeying forth and a return. And after my stories of objects that are demolished or hidden or immured, I hope that this final, very briefly recounted tale will provide a happier ending for my talk. Among the 3,400 objects that Caspar Purdon Clark sent home from India was a 17th or 18th century house front from Ahmedabad, a wooden carved house front that occupied an entire wall of the vestibule of the Indian section. When the space available to the Indian section shrank in 1955, what were the chances that something as large as this house front would ever be shown again? Now, as it happened, working in the Indian section at that time under W.G. Archer was John Irwin, a textile expert who enjoyed a close relationship with a wealthy industrial family from Ahmedabad, the city in India from which the house front had come. These industrialists, the Sarabhais, who were owners of an important textile mill, were also collectors of antique textiles. And they were shaping what would become the finest textile museum in India. Surely among the best of such institutions in the world, the Calico Museum of Textiles in Ahmedabad. And in 1959, John Irwin arranged for the Victoria and Albert Museum to sell that house front that the V&A had acquired in 1883 for £200. They sold it in 1959 to the Sarabhais for £40. Now reconstructed, it forms part of the courtyard of the Calico Museum complex. So there's a kind of poetry in this story of the Ahmedabad house front, a piece of architecture made for a house in Ahmedabad in the 18th century, packed up, taken to London in the 19th century, no longer wanted or needed or likely to be shown there in the 20th century, traveling back to Ahmedabad to be put on show in a museum there. There are aspects of this story that are ethically troubling, and yet there is the satisfying sense of at least one of these artifacts having been rescued and having come home, as it were, though of course it's traveled to a new home and a new context. I know that the stories that I've told today make the Victoria and Albert Museum look bad, but it must be acknowledged that these stories can be told because of the V&A's own meticulous documentation of its history. And it's making these records available to the interested researcher, allowing her to reach into these hidden, unflattering aspects of the museum's own history. Although the stories that I've told you today, I think are interesting in themselves, they are also useful only if they give us some kind of perspective on the present and they help us think about the future. These stories help us to see how museum objects can be threatened not just by forces outside the museum, but by those within the museum itself. The institution that preserves and claims to preserve so much can also look askance at its own collections, and changes in taste and priorities can lead to certain objects being discarded, disposed of, destroyed. And yet we have seen when tastes change, as when, say, plaster casts fell out of favor, they didn't affect all plaster casts evenly, because in contrast to the large-scale disposal of Indian things, European plaster casts continued to survive and were eventually given pride of place within the museum. During the colonial period, artifacts were acquired with great avidity, but only a small circle of specialists had any affinity or any depth of knowledge about them. No connection was forged between these objects and a larger public for whom all of these diverse objects were only uniformly souvenirs of a colonial adventure. And as times changed, as space shrank, as public interest shifted away from the faraway lands that Britain no longer controlled, even the V&A's extraordinary collections became marginalized within the V&A. The embarrassment of riches turned into an embarrassment. And what do you do when you have too much stuff? There's no space to show these things. Artifacts have fallen out of fashion. Museum is now burdened with having to take care of objects that they no longer have any need for. Things get tucked away, they get forgotten, they get destroyed. And even as these destructions are deliberated by committees, and as they are justified by the same kind of calm reasonableness with which the initial collection had been endorsed, I don't actually believe that these stories of these disappearances of large Indian objects from view are the stories of the contingencies and the circumstances of one museum's particular history. Rather, I think that they are symptomatic of a deeper ambivalence in Britain about Indian art, Indian collections, and even eventually about the recollection of Indian empire once the empire was done. I'll stop here. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Kavita. That was excellent. It's given us so much to think about. We've got a few questions coming in the chat already. While we're waiting for people to kind of gather their thoughts, I had a couple of questions that I noted down while you were talking. You've raised so much that's kind of so central to so many aspects of the museum sector, and things that I think perhaps aren't spoken about enough in terms of some of the many different roles that museums perform that are perhaps less visible than other roles. And it kind of got me thinking about a book that Olivier mentioned that you co-edited, the museum storage book, Tales from the Crypt, probably your work that I'm most familiar with myself. But it got me thinking about something you said in your introduction to that, where you mentioned that we often think of museums as institutions of display, but of course they fulfill so many other functions. And you kind of posed a different understanding of the museum in that introduction as a place that keeps things kind of safe and preserves things. So I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's the editor's fate. This talk that I've given today, I actually was thinking of it as a contribution to the book, but as happens, I never got it ready in time to be published in the book. But this was really reflecting on issues that Miriam Brusius and I had raised in that book about storage. Of course, I think that the archival function of the museum, where it becomes this sort of record keeping of objects rather than documents, is a promise that was made well in advance of the museum's capabilities of doing anything like that. But today in the digital age, I think we have actually reached a point where a lot of that promise can be fulfilled, right? And so where museums show and have always almost shown just the tiniest fraction of the objects that they possess, the opportunity to conduct sort of field work in the museum remotely for us to see objects that are not on display has only become possible with the digital turn. And I also think that what's very interesting about the agnostic nature of these digital archives, particularly of the well-funded museums that can put everything up, is that at long last we get to see the second-rate and the third-rate stuff, right? Because earlier, all you saw were the museum catalogs, which would only pick out the greatest hits. And I think being able to see a whole array of artifacts of different qualities and standards actually helps you develop a much fuller picture of what might have been at a time, what kinds of roles art might have served, what kind of different strata of audiences it might have satisfied. So I think that a promise which was made in the enthusiasms of the Victorian era, I think are now within the grasp of fulfillment today.
Definitely. Linking to that, actually, we've got a question here from an anonymous attendee, which has been upvoted by a few people, so I think it's something everyone wants to hear more about. But they wonder if you could tell us a little more about what exactly lies in deep storage. I know it's something that a lot of people find quite fascinating.
Yeah, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to tell you because I only tracked a few kinds of objects, to that place. But I think deep storage facilities generally are for things that the museum, in its role of honoring its commitment to preserve objects, feels it necessary to keep, but has very little faith that these things are ever going to be wanted to be displayed again. And so you do tend to have either things that have kind of, let's say for something like the Science Museum, certain kinds of specimens from branches of science where those specimens are not going to be, needed again. Nobody's going to need to see the 100th fossil of a particular kind of animal again. So something like that. And in the case of the V&A, I don't think it would be sensitive objects like textiles and so on, but certainly stone objects or maybe metal objects, which are very bulky and difficult to store in expensive real estate in closer to the city. They would have moved into deep storage. But yeah, I would welcome somebody taking the cue and deciding to have an adventure in deep storage and tell us more about these interesting and mysterious places.
Moving from deep storage to the display aspect of things, we've got another question here which a lot of people have liked, which is how do you think museums should go about displaying and contextualizing works that come with fraught histories? Is an interpretive label enough? That's a really good question.
Well, interpretive labels have been the way most museums have gone. And so I think that's a very sharp question, because what it's pointing to is that the display itself and the subliminal language that the encounter, with the object, the subliminal language of that encounter is not changed. So suppose today, of course, the British Museum hasn't even done a lot of changing of its labels of the Elgin marbles. But if you were to go in there, the marbles would be displayed in that triumphalist mode of, oh, we are showing you these masterpieces of Phidias, and so the language of the display itself would say absolutely nothing about the histories of despoliation and the destructiveness of the act of collecting, which at best a label might point to, right? And so if you are arguing that a museum needs to speak about its past and the difficult and fraught histories that underlie the collecting of objects, this disjuncture between the masterpiece display and the post-colonial label is also something that needs to be critiqued. And I think this question is very sharp in picking up on that. So how would you actually then alter the display of an object in order to let the display itself speak about the difficult history that lies encoded in the journey that the object made to the museum? So for that, I would say that if you look at the way the Benin bronzes are shown, let's say in the British Museum, and if you compare it to, I'm trying to remember where the museum is. I mean, is it in Benin City itself? But there is a museum in which, what would be the contextual material that might make it to a journal article, but not to the museum space. That material actually makes it to the display, right? So then you have the photographs of the punitive expedition, of the violence of the act of collecting becoming part of the display. Now, today in, let's say, academic writings, you would have a lot of documentary material that accompanies our understanding of how the Elgin marbles, let's say, were moved out of their place. The challenge would be, how do we make that part of the language of display of those objects having made those things the language of the display of the objects, have you turned the objects themselves into just illustrations of a historical tale? Where do you balance, or do you balance the relationship between aesthetic pleasure and difficult history, both of which deserve to be done? So what's coming to my mind is actually this fabulous exhibition that I had seen in the Yale Museum many, many years ago. What is her name? The fantastic Africanist who did Artifact, Susan Vogel, is that her name? So there was this fantastic exhibition that she had done, which centered, I think, around ritual pots, if I'm not mistaken. And you encountered each category of artifact that was put on display thrice. So first you encountered it in a, I think in a, like a field photograph that she had taken, which was not necessarily a very well composed or beautiful photograph. So it had, like, if she's taking a picture of the interior of a hut, it's not nicely centered. You know, there are accidental, like, bits of fabric, somebody's bedclothes jutting into the frame. But you have the photograph that she has taken in her fieldwork, in which, let's say, these ritual pots are installed in the house as a memorial for an ancestor who has died, but it's part of everyday life. So it's just in a corner of the hut. So that photograph is reconstructed in a kind of a diorama, full scale, right? And so you go into that room and you encounter the object in its context that Vogel had encountered it in. And then, yeah, I don't think the display was 3 times over, but I think the lighting was very clever. So you had general light filling the room so that you saw the whole room, and then the general light faded, and then the spotlight came and just shone on the object, right? So then you got the object in that decontextualized art museum, just look at the object for its aesthetic value. You got that view as well, right? There are also some ways of playing with display which allow you to talk about the histories of objects without reducing them to illustrations of that history, you know, but allowing us many ways of encountering and relating to those objects. That would be fabulous.
Got a question here from Mark Ledbury, who of course is the current director of the Power Institute. Very nice to know Mark's in the audience. But he raises a really interesting question about the scale problem that you mentioned, whether there are some objects that are in a sort of Goldilocks zone and those that are too small or too large are made less available. And do we see yet again the triumph of a certain oil painting imaginary, which sets the lower and upper limits for artworks chosen for display?
So Mark, that isn't a question, that's an inspiration. That's fabulous. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the Goldilocks reference and for the oil painting reference. You're absolutely right. There is an ideal size for museum display. So we do have museums valiantly trying to get us interested in coins. And it's always so difficult to get somebody to be willing to look at 30 coins in succession and see the details. So there are objects that are too small. And of course, there are objects that are so large that even if they were on display, they would just become sort of background, or they would become like diorama elements. Whereas you have the perfectly scaled object, as you're saying, you know, the oil painting scale of object, which seems made for the interiors of museums. And so that's just absolutely great. You know, very, very useful and stimulating formulation. Thank you.
I think we've got a lot of questions, but we might only have time for one more, I think. So I'll do my best to pick the one that's kind of most cutting. Actually, I might return to one of the first questions that was posed. Someone wanted to know, Debasis Bora wanted to know a little bit about the shift in interest that you mentioned from copies or cast-based copies of art to contemporary museums which dwell on almost kind of, as you mentioned, fetishize the original. And if you could briefly talk a bit more about that shift, which I think is quite a central point for your talk.
Yeah. So, this fetishization of the original, I would say that we see it in the middle of the 20th century. It becomes particularly strong, and I don't know quite enough about my international art world to know how these things are operating. But of course, the intuition is that this has a lot to do with the art market. Because this thing of the original is actually something that is much more critical for the market than even for the museum or for an art lover to enjoy the work of art that is before their eyes. So I suspect that something to do with post-war economies, something to do with the development of art market, something to do with the transatlantic trade also actually boosting the prices of artworks. I think that actually trickles into general aesthetic and critical attitudes of the time and leads to the fetishization of the unique object. I think that has a lot to do with it. It's also, of course, got something to do with the way these things inform contemporary art practice and contemporary art criticism. So it's not a surprise that someone like W.G. Archer, let's say, would be reading like Roger Fry or somebody, so that they would be all of a piece with this formalism, this idea of the unique touch of the individual genius artist, like whose imprint upon the canvas actually changes everything. And like you're really, as my supervisor used to say, you're buying an artwork or you're appreciating an artwork with your ears rather than your eyes. So you're hearing who made it rather than seeing what it is in order to give it value. But I think all of these things kind of leak into each other. The idea of significant form, the idea of abstraction, the idea of the supremacy of the artist's genius is happening alongside a kind of heating up of an international art market, which has to do with a lot of the changes in capital flows post World War II. And they all come together to create this fetishization.
Thank you, Kavita. Very, very generous responses to the questions. I think we need to wrap up now. I'm not sure if Olivier had any final comments to make. Oh, as Nick mentions as well, those of you who posed questions, will make sure to pass those on to Kavita.
Yes, I'd be happy to read the questions later at leisure. Yeah.
I don't have more comments other than my thanks. And I did want to also thank our audience. There's been an incredibly strong interest, and I think we all know why. That's a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for kicking off a wonderful series as well. Thank you, Kavita.
Thank you. My great pleasure and my great honor. Thank you very much.